The dust swirled across the empty road as Zachary Xanders rode into the small frontier town of Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876. The sound of his horse's hooves against the dry earth seemed to match the hollow beating of his heart, a heart that hadn't felt truly alive since the day he'd buried his wife and infant son 3 years prior. The townsfolk who glanced his way quickly averted their eyes when they met his gaze. There was something unsettling about the tall cowboy with grief permanently etched into the lines around his eyes. Grace Mercer wiped her brow with the back of her hand as she arranged the last of the newly arrived medical supplies on the shelves of her small apothecary. At 26, she was considered an old maid by most, but she had little concern for such opinions. After completing her unusual education in medicine back east, one of the few women permitted to study alongside men, she had traveled west, seeking a place where her skills would be valued above her gender. Redemption Creek had seemed as good a place as any to start anew. She glanced out the window just as the stranger rode past. His broad shoulders hunched slightly beneath a dusty black coat, his face shadowed by a worn hat. Something about his posture spoke of a burden carried too long, and she found herself wondering what story lay behind those slumped shoulders. Zachary dismounted outside the only saloon in town, tying his dun-colored horse to the hitching post with practiced ease. He needed a drink and information in that order. The Broken Spur Saloon was like countless others he'd frequented in the past few years, dimly lit, smelling of cheap whiskey and cheaper perfume, with a piano player half-heartedly plinking out tunes in the corner. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, his voice gruff from disuse. The man slid a glass across the counter, and Zachary downed it in one swift motion before pushing it forward for a refill. "Passing through?" the bartender asked, pouring another measure of amber liquid. "Looking for work," Zachary replied. "Heard the Double R Ranch might be hiring." The bartender nodded. "Old man Russell's always looking for good hands, especially with Roundup coming. He lost 2 men to a cattle rustling incident last month." Zachary nodded, mentally filing away the information. "Any place to get a room for the night?" "Mrs. Holloway runs a boarding house 2 streets over. Clean beds, decent food. Or there's rooms upstairs if you prefer less conversation with your accommodations." "Boarding house will do," Zachary said, leaving coins on the counter before stepping back into the harsh sunlight. Grace was locking up her shop when she noticed the stranger again, walking down the opposite side of the street. In the full light of day, she could see him more clearly, tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his hat. There was a slight limp to his walk, barely perceptible but visible to her trained eye. His face was partially obscured by several days' worth of beard, but she could make out sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. Their eyes met briefly across the dusty street. His were a startling blue, like a summer sky after a storm, but the expression in them was anything but clear, clouded with something that looked like an old, familiar pain. She offered a small nod of acknowledgement, the kind of greeting one gives to a stranger in a small town. To her surprise, he touched the brim of his hat in response before continuing on his way. "Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a wide front porch adorned with rocking chairs. Zachary negotiated a room for a week, paying in advance. The widow Holloway was a plump, cheerful woman who didn't ask questions beyond his name and how he liked his eggs. "Dinner's at 6 sharp, Mr. Xanders," she told him, as she showed him to a simple but clean room on the 2nd floor. "We don't stand on ceremony here, but I do appreciate punctuality when it comes to meal times." "Yes, madam," he replied, setting his saddlebags on the narrow bed. "The washroom is down the hall. There's always hot water in the evenings." He nodded his thanks, and she left him to his solitude. Zachary sat on the edge of the bed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. He'd been drifting for so long that the prospect of staying in one place for even a week felt strange. After losing Sarah and their newborn son to childbed fever, he'd found it impossible to remain on the small farm they'd built together in Kansas. Every corner of the house, every furrow in the field, every tree in the small orchard they'd planted, all of it had reminded him of her, of the life they'd planned together. So he'd sold the farm for a fraction of its worth and headed west, taking whatever work came his way, cattle drives, ranch hands, even a brief stint as a deputy in a town whose name he could no longer recall. Nothing seemed to ease the hollow ache in his chest, but physical labor and constant movement at least provided temporary distraction. He washed the trail dust from his face and hands before heading downstairs for dinner. Mrs. Holloway's dining room held a long oak table that could seat 12, though tonight there were only 4 other boarders, an elderly bookkeeper who worked at the bank, a young schoolteacher, and a married couple who ran the dry goods store. Conversation flowed around him as he ate the hearty beef stew and fresh bread. He answered direct questions politely, but offered nothing more, and soon the others seemed to accept his reticence as simply the way of things. "You mentioned you're looking for work at the Double R," Mrs. Holloway said as she refilled his coffee cup. "My late husband worked for Mr. Russell for nearly 20 years. Good man, fair employer. If you head out there tomorrow, tell him Martha Holloway sent you." "I appreciate that," Zachary said. "Have you worked cattle before?" "Yes, madam. Grew up on a ranch in Texas before." He trailed off, unwilling to venture into personal territory. "Been working various outfits for the past few years." Mrs. Holloway seemed to sense his reluctance and changed the subject, turning to ask the schoolteacher about preparations for the upcoming town social. The next morning, Zachary rode out to the Double R Ranch. The property sprawled across thousands of acres of rolling prairie and low hills, with the snow-capped peaks of the distant mountains serving as backdrop. The main house and outbuildings came into view after an hour's ride, solid, well-maintained structures that spoke of prosperity and permanence. A grizzled older man was shoeing a horse in front of the barn when Zachary rode up. "Looking for Mr. Russell," Zachary said, dismounting. The man straightened up, revealing a tall frame that age had not yet stooped. His weathered face was creased with lines, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as he looked Zachary up and down. "Found him," he said, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "James Russell, and you are?" "Zachary Xanders. Mrs. Holloway suggested I come see you about work." Russell's expression softened slightly at the mention of the widow. "Martha's got good sense. You've worked cattle?" "Yes, sir. Grew up on a ranch in the Texas Panhandle. Been working various outfits since then." "Any trouble with the law I should know about?" "No, sir." Russell studied him for a long moment. "Don't much care what ghost you're carrying, son, as long as they don't interfere with your work. We start at dawn and finish when the job's done. Pay is $40 a month plus room and board. Roundup starts in 2 weeks, so there's plenty to do beforehand." "Sounds fair," Zachary said. "Foreman's name is Pete Donnelly. He'll show you where to bunk and what needs doing. I expect a full day's work for a full day's pay. That understood?" "Yes, sir." Russell nodded. "Pete's in the barn. Tell him you're hired." The work at the Double R was hard but straightforward, mending fences, checking on distant herds, breaking new horses, repairing equipment in preparation for the spring roundup. Zachary threw himself into the physical labor, finding solace in the bone-deep exhaustion that allowed him to fall into dreamless sleep each night in the bunkhouse. The ranch employed 15 men full-time, with more hired on for roundup, most kept to themselves, respecting Zachary's obvious desire for solitude. Pete Donnelly, the foreman, was a fair man who assigned tasks based on ability rather than seniority, and he quickly recognized Zachary's skill with horses. "Where did you learn to handle the difficult ones like that?" he asked one afternoon, after Zachary had successfully broken a particularly stubborn Mustang. "My father raised quarter horses," Zachary replied, leading the now docile animal to the corral. "Had a way with the troublemakers. Taught me that fighting them just makes them fight back harder." "Smart man, your father." Zachary nodded, a brief flicker of old grief passing across his features. He was. 2 weeks into his employment, Zachary rode into town with several other ranch hands for supplies and mail. While the others headed straight for the saloon, he made his way to the general store to purchase tobacco and ammunition. As he was paying, the bell above the door chimed, and he turned to see the woman he'd noticed his first day in town, the one with the intelligent eyes who had nodded to him across the street. Grace stopped short when she saw the tall cowboy at the counter. He looked different than he had 2 weeks ago, cleaner for one thing, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved to reveal a strong jawline. The grief was still there in his eyes. but it seemed less raw somehow, as if physical labor had temporarily dulled its edge. "Miss Mercer," the shopkeeper greeted her, "your order came in on yesterday's stage. Let me get it for you." "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," she replied, moving toward the counter. Zachary stepped aside to make room for her, nodding politely. "Madam?" "Mr. Xanders, isn't it?" she asked. "I believe you're staying at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house." Surprise flickered across his face. "I was, working out at the Double R now." "I see. I'm Grace Mercer. I run the apothecary across the street." "You're a doctor?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Not officially, though I trained at a women's medical college in Philadelphia," she replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. She'd become accustomed to skepticism from men regarding her profession. To her surprise, he simply nodded. "Must be useful, having medical knowledge out here." "It is," she agreed, studying him more closely. His posture was rigid, as if he was uncomfortable with conversation, but his eyes held no judgment, only a mild curiosity. "Are you enjoying your work at the Double R?" "It's good work," he said, which wasn't quite an answer. Mr. Bennett returned with a wooden crate. "Here you are, Miss Mercer. All the supplies you ordered, plus those special herbs from San Francisco." "Thank you. Could you have it delivered to my shop? It's rather heavy." "Of course. Tommy will bring it over within the hour." Zachary picked up his purchases. "Good day, Miss Mercer," he said, touching the brim of his hat before turning to leave. "Mr. Xanders," she called after him, acting on impulse. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my home this evening. Nothing formal, just a few friends for dinner and conversation. Mrs. Holloway will be there. You're welcome to join us if you'd like." He looked genuinely startled by the invitation, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse outright. Then something shifted in his expression, a brief internal struggle visible only in the slight tightening around his eyes. "Thank you," he said finally. "What time?" 6 o'clock. I'm in the White House behind the apothecary." He nodded once more before exiting the store, leaving Grace wondering what had prompted her to issue the invitation. Perhaps it was the glimpse of profound loneliness she'd seen in his eyes, or maybe simple curiosity about the quiet cowboy who carried himself like a man much older than his years. Zachary spent the remainder of the afternoon questioning his decision to accept the invitation. Social gatherings were something he'd actively avoided since Sarah's death. The prospect of small talk and polite conversation felt not just unappealing, but almost physically painful. Yet something about Grace Mercer's direct gaze and forthright manner had made refusal seem impossible. At 5:45, freshly bathed and wearing his one decent shirt, he found himself walking toward the small white house behind the apothecary. The sound of laughter drifted through the open windows, momentarily stopping him in his tracks. It had been so long since he'd been in the company of people genuinely enjoying themselves that the sound seemed almost foreign. Before he could reconsider, the front door opened and Grace appeared on the porch. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, her brown hair arranged in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. "Mr. Xanders," she called. "I thought I saw someone approaching. Please come in." The interior of Grace's home was modest but comfortable, with bookshelves lining one wall of the sitting room and simple but attractive furnishings. Mrs. Holloway was there, along with the school teacher from the boarding house, a middle-aged couple he didn't recognize, and an older gentleman who turned out to be the town doctor. "Dr. Thornton has been kind enough to allow me to assist him with patients," Grace explained as she introduced the older physician. "He's been teaching me the practical aspects of frontier medicine that weren't covered in my formal education." "Miss Mercer is being modest," Dr. Thornton said, his voice gruff but affectionate. "She knows more about modern medical techniques than I ever learned. I'm the one getting an education." Dinner was a simple but delicious affair. Roast chicken, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily around the table, touching on town news, books, and national politics. Zachary remained mostly silent, offering brief responses when directly addressed, but otherwise content to observe. He found his attention repeatedly drawn to Grace. There was something compelling about the way she spoke confidently, but without arrogance, listening as intently as she talked. Her hands were elegant but strong, the hands of someone who worked for a living. When she smiled, which was often, the expression transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. After dinner, the men moved to the porch with pipes while Grace and the other women cleared the table. Zachary stood at the railing, gazing out at the darkening sky. "First time I've seen you in town after sundown," Dr. Thornton commented, coming to stand beside him. "Miss Mercer has a way of drawing people out of their shells." Zachary made a non-committal sound. "Known her long?" he asked after a moment. "Since she arrived about 8 months ago," the doctor replied. "Caused quite a stir at first, a woman setting up an apothecary, claiming medical knowledge. Some folks were scandalized." He chuckled. "That changed quick enough when she saved the blacksmith's boy after a rattlesnake bite. Now half the town consults her before they come to me." "She seems capable," Zachary said. "That she is, sharp as a tack and twice as determined. Reminds me of my late wife in that regard." The doctor puffed on his pipe. "She's had her share of hardship, our Miss Mercer. Lost her parents to influenza when she was 18. Had a fiancé who couldn't abide the idea of her pursuing medicine, gave her an ultimatum, her studies or him. She chose medicine," Zachary guessed. "Indeed she did. Takes courage to choose your own path, especially for a woman. This town's lucky to have her." The doctor glanced sideways at him. "Though I suspect she gets lonely sometimes. Not many here who share her interests or education." Before Zachary could respond, Grace joined them on the porch. "Are you gentlemen solving the world's problems out here?" "Just getting acquainted," Dr. Thornton said. "I was telling Mr. Xanders about your battle with the town council to open your apothecary." Grace rolled her eyes. "Hardly a battle, more like a prolonged negotiation with men who thought women should stick to midwifery and herb gardens." "Yet here you are," Zachary observed. "Here I am," she agreed with a small smile. "Though I did compromise on the sign. Originally I wanted it to read G. Mercer, physician and apothecary. Now it's simply Mercer's Apothecary." "Sometimes small victories are enough," Zachary said quietly. Grace studied him with interest. "Yes, they are. Would you like to see my garden? I grow many of my own medicinal herbs." The small kitchen garden behind the house was meticulously maintained with neat rows of plants whose names Zachary didn't know. Grace moved through them with obvious affection, pointing out different varieties and explaining their uses. "This is foxglove digitalis. Used properly, it can strengthen a failing heart. This is willow bark for pain and fever. And here's comfrey for healing wounds." "My mother kept an herb garden," Zachary said, surprising himself with the voluntary offering of personal information. "Nothing this extensive, but she knew which plants could heal and which could harm." "Was she a healer?" "Not formally, just knowledge passed down from her mother, and hers before that." He touched a fragrant leaf, the scent bringing back unexpected memories. "She used to make a tea with mint and something else when any of us had stomach ailments." "Probably chamomile," Grace suggested, indicating a plant with daisy-like flowers. "It's excellent for digestive troubles." He nodded. "That sounds right." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments before Grace spoke again. "May I ask how long you've been traveling? You have the look of someone who hasn't stayed in one place for very long." Zachary stiffened slightly. "What makes you say that?" "Just an observation. You carry yourself like someone who's ready to leave at a moment's notice." He was saved from responding by Mrs. Holloway calling from the back door. "Grace, dear, we should be going." "It's getting late." The evening ended with polite goodbyes and thank yous. As Zachary prepared to depart, Grace handed him a small paper packet. "Willow bark tea," she explained. "For that old injury that's causing your limp. It will help with the pain." He stared at the packet, then at her, surprised by her perception. The injury, a badly broken leg from a fall during a cattle drive 2 years ago, troubled him mainly in damp weather, or after long days in the saddle. "How did you know?" he asked. "I observe," she said simply. "It's part of diagnosis. Steep it in hot water for 10 minutes before drinking." "Thank you," he said, tucking the packet into his pocket. "For the tea and for the invitation. It was a pleasant evening." "You're welcome, Mr. Xanders. Perhaps we'll see more of you in town." "Perhaps," he agreed, though he had no real intention of changing his solitary habits. Yet over the next few weeks, Zachary found himself riding into town more frequently than was strictly necessary. Sometimes he would stop at the apothecary under the pretense of needing liniment for sore muscles or salve for rope-burned hands. Grace always greeted him with the same warm smile, taking time to talk with him despite her other customers. On one such visit, he arrived to find her dealing with a distraught mother whose young son had a high fever and painful rash. "It looks like scarlet fever, Mrs. Johnson," Grace was saying as she examined the flushed child. "He needs to be kept cool and given plenty of fluids. I'll prepare a tincture to help bring down the fever." Zachary waited quietly by the door until the mother had departed with medicine and instructions. Grace looked tired as she turned to him, a strand of hair escaping from her usually neat bun. "Mr. Xanders, what can I help you with today?" "Nothing urgent," he said. "I can come back another time if you're busy." She shook her head. "No need. That was my last patient for the day, I hope. It's been one thing after another since dawn." She moved to wash her hands in a basin. "There's been an outbreak of scarlet fever in the mining camp north of town. 5 cases so far. Sounds serious. It can be, especially for the very young or very old." She dried her hands on a clean towel. "Dr. Thornton and I have been taking turns visiting the camp. But it's a difficult journey, especially with him being 72. Zachary hesitated only briefly. "I could escort you there, if you need to make another visit." The trail can be dangerous for a woman alone. Surprise and then gratitude crossed her features. "That's very kind of you. I was planning to go tomorrow, actually. Dr. Thornton was going to arrange for someone from the livery to accompany me. But if you're willing, I'd need to clear it with the foreman, but I don't think it would be a problem." "Thank you. I'd be happy to compensate you for your time." He shook his head. "No need for that." The next morning, Zachary met Grace at the apothecary just after dawn. She wore a practical riding outfit split skirt, sturdy boots, and a simple blouse, with her medical supplies packed in saddlebags. "You ride well," he commented as they made their way along the narrow trail that led into the foothills. "My father believed all his children should know how, regardless of gender," she replied. "My brothers complained about learning to cook and sew, but I never minded the lessons traditionally reserved for boys." "Your brothers, are they still in the East?" "Thomas is a lawyer in Boston. James died at Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," Zachary said, the familiar words of condolence feeling inadequate. She nodded her acknowledgement. "Were you in the war?" "Briefly, joined near the end, when they were taking anyone who could sit a horse and shoot straight. Saw action at Palmito Ranch." "The last battle," Grace said. "After the surrender, wasn't it?" "News travels slow in Texas," he said dryly. "By the time we heard about Appomattox, we'd already fought and lost good men." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a hawk, the only sounds. The mining camp came into view by mid-morning, a collection of rough cabins and tents clustered around the mine entrance. A haggard-looking man met them at the edge of the camp. "Miss Mercer, thank God you've come." "2 more children have taken ill since yesterday." Grace immediately dismounted, handing her reins to Zachary. "Take me to them, Mr. Davis. Have the instructions I left been followed?" "As best we could, madam. Water's scarce up here. Makes it hard to keep things clean." For the next several hours, Zachary watched as Grace moved from cabin to cabin, examining patients, dispensing medicine, and giving instructions. She was different here, her manner more authoritative, her movements efficient and purposeful. The miners and their families treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked when she emerged from a tent where a young girl lay fevered and restless. "Yes, actually. We need more clean water. The creek to the east has the clearest source. Could you fill these?" She handed him several canteens. He nodded, taking them and heading in the direction she had indicated. The creek was about half a mile from the camp, its water running cold and clear over smooth stones. As he filled the canteens, Zachary found himself reflecting on the woman he'd just watched at work. There was something compelling about Grace's competence, about the way she faced suffering without flinching, but also without becoming hardened to it. It reminded him, in some ways, of the best officers he'd known during his brief military service, those who could make difficult decisions while still valuing the human cost. When he returned to the camp, he found her sitting outside one of the cabins, head bowed in what appeared to be exhaustion or defeat. He approached quietly, not wanting to intrude on a private moment. "Miss Mercer?" She looked up, and he was startled to see tears in her eyes. "Mr. Xanders. Thank you for the water. Is everything all right?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "No. We lost little Emma Collins. She was only 4. Zachary set the canteens down and sat beside her on the rough bench. "I'm sorry. It's the helplessness that's hardest to bear," she said after a moment. "Knowing what's happening inside their bodies, but being unable to stop it. Medical science has come so far, and yet in moments like these, I feel as if we know nothing at all." He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort, sensing she wouldn't welcome them. Instead, he simply sat with her in silence, a witness to her grief and frustration. Finally, she straightened her shoulders. "There are 5 other children who need care. I can't save Emma, but perhaps I can help them." They didn't leave the mining camp until late afternoon, by which time Grace had done all she could for the remaining patients. The return journey was mostly silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the sun began to set behind the mountains. As they approached town, Grace finally spoke. "Thank you for coming with me today. Your presence was helpful." "I didn't do much," he said. "You were there," she replied simply. Sometimes that's enough. When they reached the apothecary, he helped her dismount and carried her saddlebags inside. The shop was dark and quiet, the closed sign still hanging in the window from the day before. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, lighting a lamp. "Or something stronger? I find I need something after days like today." "Coffee would be fine," he said, though the idea of whiskey was tempting. She led him through the shop to her living quarters at the back, a small kitchen and sitting room that he had glimpsed during the dinner party. She busied herself with the stove and coffee pot, while he stood awkwardly, hat in hand, unsure of his place in this domestic scene. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to a chair at the small kitchen table. "You must be tired too." He sat, watching as she moved efficiently around the kitchen, her earlier weariness seemingly forgotten in the routine task. "Do you often lose patience?" he asked. She paused in measuring coffee grounds. "More often than I would like, less often than might be expected given the conditions out here. Each one stays with me, though. I remember all their names." "That seems a heavy burden." She poured water into the pot before turning to face him. "It is, but I think it's necessary. The day I stop feeling each loss is the day I should stop practicing medicine." There was something in her expression, a combination of strength and vulnerability, that stirred something long dormant in Zachary's chest. He looked away, uncomfortable with the sensation. "What about you?" she asked, sitting across from him while the coffee brewed. "What burdens do you carry, Mr. Xanders?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. "What makes you think I carry any?" "As I said before, I observe. It's there in your eyes, in the way you hold yourself apart from others." She tilted her head slightly. "You don't have to tell me. Of course, we all have the right to our private sorrows." Perhaps it was the events of the day, or the quiet intimacy of the kitchen, or simply that it had been so long since anyone had asked with genuine interest, but Zachary found himself speaking. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son who lived less than a day. They died 3 years ago." Grace's expression softened with understanding. "I'm very sorry." "Childbed fever," he continued, the words coming more easily now that he had started. "The doctor said there was nothing to be done. One day she was fine, laughing, making plans for the baby's room, and 2 weeks later, I was burying them both." "That's a terrible loss," she said quietly. "Were you married long?" 4 years. We met in Texas after the war. Her father had a small ranch next to my family's. When my parents died of typhoid in '68, we decided to make a fresh start, sold the Texas property and bought land in Kansas. He stared at his hands, remembering the farm they had built together. We had good soil, good neighbors. Everything was going according to plan until it wasn't, Grace finished for him when he trailed off. He nodded, unable to continue. She rose to check the coffee, pouring 2 cups and setting one before him. The strong, familiar aroma helped ground him in the present moment. "Is that why you came west?" she asked. "To leave those memories behind?" "Partly," he admitted. though I've found memories aren't so easily outrun. No, they aren't, she agreed. They become part of us, for better or worse. They drank their coffee in a silence that felt comfortable rather than strained. When they had finished, Zachary knew he should leave. It was growing late, and propriety demanded he not linger in an unmarried woman's home after dark. Yet he found himself reluctant to end this unexpected connection. "I should go," he said finally, rising from his chair. "Thank you for the coffee." She walked him to the door. "Thank you again for your help today. I truly appreciate it. If you need an escort to the mining camp again, I'd be willing," he found himself offering. Her smile lit up her tired face. "I may take you up on that, Mr. Xanders." "Zachary," he said impulsively. "My name is Zachary." "Zachary," she repeated. "Then you must call me Grace." In the weeks that followed, Zachary found himself drawn more and more into Grace's orbit. He accompanied her on 2 more visits to the mining camp, where the scarlet fever outbreak was finally subsiding. He began stopping by the apothecary whenever he was in town, sometimes with a legitimate need for supplies, sometimes merely to exchange a few words. The ranch foreman noticed the change in his usually solitary behavior. "You sweet on the lady doctor, Xanders?" Pete asked one evening, as they sat by the bunkhouse fire. Zachary gave him a sharp look. "She's a friend?" Pete raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant. She's a fine woman by all accounts. Just never seen you take an interest in socializing before." Zachary couldn't deny that his feelings for Grace were evolving beyond friendship. There was something about her intelligence, her compassion, her quiet strength, that called to him in a way he hadn't experienced since Sarah. The realization brought both hope and guilt. It seemed a betrayal of Sarah's memory to feel this way about another woman, yet he couldn't deny the lightening of his spirit whenever he was in Grace's company. For her part, Grace found herself looking forward to Zachary's visits with an eagerness that both excited and alarmed her. After the disappointment of her broken engagement, she had focused solely on her career, convincing herself that her work provided all the fulfillment she needed. Zachary's presence in her life was awakening desires and dreams she had long suppressed. Their growing connection did not go unnoticed in the small town. Mrs. Holloway, ever the romantic, took to inviting them both to Sunday dinners, seating them side by side, and finding excuses to leave them alone together. Dr. Thornton watched with approving eyes, telling anyone who would listen that Miss Mercer has finally met her intellectual match. Not everyone viewed their friendship with approval, however. The town banker, Harold Wilkins, had made his interest in Grace clear since her arrival, despite her polite but firm rejections. He watched with growing resentment as she bestowed on the taciturn cowboy the smiles and attention he believed should be his. The spring roundup kept Zachary busy from dawn until dusk for nearly 3 weeks, leaving him little time to visit town. When the work was finally complete, he rode in with several other ranch hands for a long, anticipated evening of relaxation. He stopped first at the apothecary, but found it closed, a note on the door indicating that Grace had been called to assist with a difficult birth at a homestead several miles out of town. Disappointed but understanding the demands of her profession, he decided to join the other men at the Broken Spur Saloon. The saloon was crowded and noisy, filled with cowboys flush with their roundup pay. Zachary found a relatively quiet corner and ordered a whiskey, content to observe the revelry rather than participate. He was on his second drink when Harold Wilkins approached his table, accompanied by 2 well-dressed men Zachary recognized as members of the town council. "Xanders," Wilkins said, his tone just this side of civil. "Enjoying your visit to civilization?" Zachary merely nodded, disliking the man on principle but seeing no reason to be openly hostile. "I was just telling my friends here about your frequent visits to Miss Mercer's establishment," Wilkins continued, a malicious gleam in his eye. "Quite devoted to her medicinal skills, aren't you?" The implication in his tone was unmistakable. Zachary set his glass down carefully, keeping his temper in check. "Miss Mercer is a skilled healer and a credit to this town." "Oh, indeed," Wilkins agreed with false sincerity, though one wonders what other skills she might possess to attract such regular attention from a man like yourself. Zachary rose slowly to his feet, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll want to clarify your meaning, Mr. Wilkins." The banker smirked, too caught up in his jealousy to recognize the danger. I simply find it curious that a drifter with no apparent prospects has become so close to an unmarried woman of means and education. Some might question her judgment or your intentions. The saloon had grown quiet, the other patrons sensing the brewing confrontation. Miss Mercer's judgment is sound, Zachary said evenly, and my intentions are none of your concern. They become my concern when they affect the reputation of a woman I hold in high esteem, Wilkins retorted. A woman who deserves better than a saddle tramp with a mysterious past. Something in Zachary snapped. Before he fully realized what he was doing, he had Wilkins by the collar, lifting him slightly off his feet. "Apologize," he said, his voice low and controlled, despite the rage coursing through him. Fear replaced the smugness in Wilkins' eyes. "Unhand me at once. This is assault." "It's not assault yet," Zachary said, "but it will be if you don't apologize for insulting Miss Mercer." "I didn't insult her. I merely suggested—" "You suggested something unworthy of her and of you," Zachary interrupted. "Apologize. Or I'll give you reason to remember this conversation every time you look in a mirror." One of the council members laid a hand on Zachary's arm. "Now, Mr. Xanders, there's no need for violence. I'm sure Harold meant no disrespect to Miss Mercer. Did you, Harold?" Wilkins, seeing no support forthcoming from the gathered crowd, swallowed his pride. "No, of course not. I apologize if my words were misconstrued." Zachary released him with a slight shove, still seething but unwilling to cause further scene. "Stay away from her," he warned quietly, "and stay away from me." He tossed some coins on the table and strode out of the saloon, needing fresh air to clear his head. The encounter with Wilkins had forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding, the question of what exactly his intentions toward Grace were. Did he have the right to pursue her, carrying as he did the weight of his past? Could he offer her the kind of life she deserved? And even if he could, was he ready to open his heart fully again, knowing the devastating pain that could come from loving and losing? He walked aimlessly through the quiet streets, eventually finding himself outside Grace's darkened house. Standing there in the moonlight, he made a decision. He would withdraw, create distance between them before his presence in her life caused her harm. Her reputation, her standing in the community, these were too precious to risk for whatever uncertain happiness they might find together. Grace returned to town the next afternoon, tired but exhilarated after successfully delivering twins to a homesteader's wife. She was surprised to find a note from Zachary waiting for her, delivered by one of the ranch hands. Its contents were brief and formal. "Miss Mercer, I regret that my duties at the ranch will prevent me from visiting town for the foreseeable future. Thank you for your friendship these past months. Respectfully, Z. Xanders." She read the note twice, confusion giving way to hurt. What had happened in her absence? The abrupt change in tone from their last warm conversation made no sense. That evening, Mrs. Holloway stopped by the apothecary just as Grace was closing up. "I thought you might like some company for dinner," the older woman said, "and perhaps an explanation for Mr. Xanders' sudden change of heart." Over a simple meal in Grace's kitchen, Mrs. Holloway related the confrontation at the saloon, as described to her by her cousin, who had witnessed the entire exchange. "So you see, dear, he was defending your honor," she concluded, "quite forcefully, from what I hear." Grace set down her fork, her appetite gone. "That explains the note. He thinks his presence in my life is somehow damaging to my reputation." "Men can be remarkably thick-headed about such things," Mrs. Holloway observed, "especially men with noble intentions." "Noble or not, it's ridiculous," Grace said, irritation replacing her earlier hurt. "I'm perfectly capable of deciding for myself whose company I wish to keep, regardless of what Harold Wilkins or anyone else might think." "Perhaps you should tell him that," Mrs. Holloway suggested. "Though you might want to wait a day or two. Men also tend to be stubborn when they believe they're doing the right thing." Grace did wait, but not out of concern for Zachary's stubbornness. A sudden outbreak of influenza in town kept her busy from dawn until well past dusk for nearly a week. By the time the worst had passed, her anger had cooled, replaced by a clearer understanding of her own feelings. She had fallen in love with Zachary Xanders. The realization came not as a sudden epiphany, but as a quiet certainty, as if acknowledging something she had known for some time. Despite his grief, despite his reluctance to speak of his past or future, despite the walls he had built around his heart, or perhaps because of all these things, she loved him. And if there was one thing Grace Mercer had never been, it was a woman who shied away from difficult truths. She rode out to the Double R Ranch on a clear morning in late spring. The foreman directed her to a distant pasture where Zachary was mending fences, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness when she approached. "Miss Mercer," he said formally, removing his hat. "Is everything all right in town?" "Everything except your sudden disappearance from it," she replied, dismounting. "May I speak with you privately?" He glanced around at the open prairie. "Not much privacy to be had here." "It will suffice," she said, leading her horse to a small copse of trees nearby. He followed reluctantly, his posture rigid with tension. "I received your note," she began, when they were relatively secluded. "Then you understand my position," he said, not meeting her eyes. "No, I don't. I understand you had an altercation with Harold Wilkins, who was a petty, jealous man, not worth a moment of your concern, or mine." Zachary looked startled by her directness. "You know about that? This is a small town, Zachary. Little remains secret for long." She stepped closer to him. "What I don't understand is why you would allow someone like Wilkins to dictate the terms of our friendship." "It's not just Wilkins," he said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's the position I've put you in. You've worked hard to establish yourself here, to earn respect for your skills and knowledge. My presence in your life endangers that." "That is the most absurd thing I've ever heard," she said flatly. "My reputation is built on my work, not on whose company I keep. And even if it weren't, I'm quite capable of deciding for myself what risks are worth taking." "Grace, no, let me finish. You've spent the past 3 years running from your grief, convincing yourself that you don't deserve happiness, that somehow being alone is the proper penance for surviving when your wife and child didn't." She softened her tone. "I understand grief, Zachary. I've lost people I love too. But grief isn't meant to be a life sentence." He stared at her, his blue eyes turbulent with emotion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care for you. Deeply. And I believe you care for me too." She took a deep breath. "I'm saying that there comes a point where you have to decide whether to keep living in the past or to take a chance on the future." "It's not that simple," he said, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. "Of course it's not simple. Nothing worthwhile ever is." She reached out, touching his arm gently. "But it is a choice, Zachary. Your choice." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. "What if I can't be what you need? What if this whatever is between us ends in more pain?" "Then we'll face that together, if it comes," she said. "But I'd rather risk pain than never know what might have been." For a long moment, he was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with a movement that seemed almost involuntary, he raised his hand to touch her cheek. "You see something in me that I lost sight of long ago?" he said softly. "I see a good man who's been carrying his burdens alone for too long," she replied. "A man who deserves a second chance at happiness." He drew her closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know if I remember how to be happy." "Then perhaps we can learn together," she whispered just before his lips met hers, in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I do care for you, Grace, more than I thought possible, but I need time to be sure, to be worthy." "Then take the time you need," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed were a time of cautious exploration for both of them. Zachary began visiting town regularly again, though now their meetings had a new dimension. Walks along the creek at sunset, quiet dinners at Grace's home, long conversations about books and ideas and dreams. He spoke more freely of Sarah and the son he had never known, finding that sharing his memories with Grace didn't diminish them, but somehow made them easier to carry. She, in turn, told him of her struggles to be accepted in a field dominated by men, of the sacrifices she had made for her career, of her own doubts and fears. The town noticed the deepening relationship, of course. There were a few raised eyebrows and whispered comments, but for the most part, the citizens of Redemption Creek were supportive. Mrs. Holloway beamed with satisfaction whenever she saw them together, while Dr. Thornton gruffly told Zachary that, if you hurt her, I'll come after you with my surgical instruments. Even Harold Wilkins seemed to have accepted the situation, nodding stiffly when they passed on the street, but making no further trouble. By midsummer, Zachary had made a decision. He approached James Russell with a proposition. I'd like to buy the old Miller place, he said, referring to an abandoned homestead on the edge of Double R land. It's been sitting empty since old Joe died last winter, and it borders the creek that runs near town. Russell studied him thoughtfully. Planning to put down roots, are you? Yes, sir, if the offer's fair. It's fair enough, Russell said. Joe had no family to speak of, and the property reverted to me when he passed. He was a good neighbor and helped me when I was starting out. I think he'd approve of someone making use of the place. He named a price that was reasonable, if not cheap. I can pay half now and the rest after the fall roundup, Zachary said. Russell nodded. Seems we have a deal then. He extended his hand. You planning on ranching, farming, or both? Some of both, I expect. The land's good for crops near the creek, and there's enough pasture for a small herd. Good thinking. Diversification helps when times get lean. Russell gave him a knowing look. This wouldn't have anything to do with our town's lady doctor, would it? Zachary felt a flush creep up his neck. It might. Well, for what it's worth, I think you'd make a good match. She's got sense and spine, that one. That she does, Zachary agreed. The Miller place needed work. The roof leaked, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and the fields had gone to weeds, but the house itself was solidly built, and the location was ideal, just a mile outside of town. Zachary spent every spare moment repairing and improving the property, often working by lantern light long after his regular duties at the ranch were complete. Grace rode out to see the homestead one evening in late August, finding Zachary on the roof, replacing rotted shingles. He climbed down when he saw her approaching, wiping his hands on his pants before helping her dismount. So this is the famous Miller place I've been hearing about, she said, looking around with interest. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you've been working yourself to exhaustion on it. It needed some attention, he said with typical understatement. Would you like to see inside? The interior was simple but spacious, a large main room with a stone fireplace, a separate kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The floors had been recently scrubbed, the windows washed, and new curtains hung. Mrs. Holloway helped with those, Zachary said, when he caught Grace fingering the curtains. Said no house is a home without proper window dressings. It's lovely, Grace said, turning to face him. But I'm curious why the sudden interest in property ownership. I thought you were content at the Double R. He took a deep breath, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a young man courting Sarah. I've been thinking about the future, about putting down roots. I see, she said, her expression carefully neutral. And have these thoughts led to any conclusions? They have. He took her hands in his. Grace, I know I'm not the man you might have imagined for yourself. I'm not educated like you. Don't have much to offer except hard work and a heart that's learning to hope again because of you. Her eyes softened. Those seem like valuable offerings to me. What I'm trying to say badly is that I love you. I didn't think I could feel this way again after Sarah. Didn't think I deserved to. But you've shown me that the heart can heal, can expand to hold both past and present. He squeezed her hands gently. If you could see your way clear to sharing this life with me, I'd consider myself the most fortunate of men. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Are you asking me to marry you, Zachary Xanders? I am, he said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Will you? Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. He pulled her into his arms then, kissing her with all the love and hope and promise he felt for their future together. They were married in the town church on a golden October afternoon, with Mrs. Holloway crying happily in the front pew and Dr. Thornton giving away the bride. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, held in the newly completed community hall. Never seen Xanders smile so much, Pete Donnelly commented to James Russell as they watched the couple's first dance. Man's been transformed. Love will do that, Russell replied, especially when it comes after great loss. Makes a man appreciate the second chance all the more. Grace and Zachary moved into the renovated Miller place immediately after the wedding. Grace continued her medical practice, converting one of the bedrooms into an examination room where she could see patients when weather or circumstances made travel to town difficult. Zachary divided his time between his growing herd of cattle and the fields where he planted wheat and corn. They settled into a rhythm of shared work and shared joy, each day building upon the foundation of trust and understanding they had established. There were challenges. Of course, drought threatened their first harvest, and Grace faced a crisis of confidence when she lost a patient to a condition she felt she should have been able to treat. But they faced each difficulty together, finding strength in their partnership. Zachary learned to express his feelings more openly, while Grace came to appreciate the quiet steadiness that was his nature. They complemented each other in ways neither had anticipated, but both treasured. A year after their wedding, Grace discovered she was expecting a child. The news brought both joy and anxiety, especially for Zachary, whose memories of Sarah's difficult childbirth haunted him anew. "I can't lose you," he confessed one night as they lay together, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "You won't," she assured him. "I'm healthy, and Dr. Thornton will be with me. And unlike many women in my condition, I have the advantage of medical knowledge myself." Despite her reassurances, Zachary insisted on bringing in additional help for the farm as her pregnancy progressed, wanting her to rest as much as possible. His protectiveness might have chafed had Grace not understood its source, not a lack of faith in her strength, but a deep fear born of past trauma. On a stormy night in early summer, their daughter was born after a labor that, while long, was without serious complication. Zachary paced outside the bedroom door, memories of another birth threatening to overwhelm him, until Dr. Thornton emerged with a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Xanders. You have a healthy daughter and a wife who's asking for you." He entered the bedroom with trepidation that dissolved the moment he saw Grace, tired but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your daughter," she said, her voice filled with wonder. He approached the bed cautiously, almost afraid to believe in this moment of perfect happiness. The baby was tiny, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly opened, were the deep blue of all newborns. "She's beautiful," he whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Like her mother." Grace shifted the baby into his arms. "I thought we might name her Sarah, if that's all right with you." Tears filled his eyes as he looked down at his daughter. "Sarah Grace Xanders," he said, testing the name. "It's perfect." In the years that followed, the Xanders family grew and prospered. A son joined them 2 years after Sarah's birth, followed by twin boys 3 years later. The homestead expanded as well, with additional rooms added to the house and more land purchased from the Double R, when James Russell finally retired to live with his daughter in California. Grace continued her medical practice, training a young woman from town as her assistant and eventual successor. Zachary's cattle herd became known for its quality, and his crops consistently yielded well even in difficult years. They faced hardships: the severe winter of '82 that decimated herds across the territory, the scarlet fever that nearly claimed their youngest son, the fire that destroyed the barn and had to be rebuilt from scratch. But through it all, their partnership remained unshakable, a source of strength and comfort that sustained them through every challenge. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they hosted a celebration at their home, inviting friends and neighbors to share in the milestone. As twilight fell, they slipped away from the festivities to stand together on the porch, looking out over the land they had nurtured and the life they had built. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "All those years ago, when you rode into Redemption Creek with grief in your eyes?" Zachary shook his head, his arm tightening around her waist. "Never. I thought my life was behind me then, that the best I could hope for was to exist day to day, finding what small distractions I could from the pain. And now?" He turned to face her, the lines around his eyes now speaking more of laughter than sorrow, though the grief would always be there, a part of who he was. "Now I know that life can begin again, even when you think it's ended. That joy can follow sorrow, and love can heal even the deepest wounds." "You once told me I saw gold where you only saw dust," Grace reminded him. "Do you see it now? The gold?" He looked past her to where their children played with friends in the yard, to the home they had created together, to the community that had embraced them both. Finally, he looked back to her face, older now, with lines of her own, but still beautiful to him. Still the woman who had seen possibility where he had seen only emptiness. "I see it," he said softly. "Every day, in everything around us, in you." She reached up to touch his face, her eyes filled with the same love that had first given him the courage to hope again. "Then my work here is done," she teased. "Never," he said, drawing her close. "We're just getting started." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together, two people who had found in each other not just love, but redemption, a second chance at a life richer and fuller than either had dared to dream possible.